Welcome to the Dublin Bible Talks, midweek Bible talks for workers in Dublin. I'm Cameron Jones. The final third of 1 Samuel is filled with pain. David running away, fleeing for his life, desperate. It's an arrow that points forward. And please consider joining us live on Wednesdays from your workplace, 1 p.m. Dublin Time on Zoom. It's a simple way of identifying as a Christian in your workplace. Simply use the link bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. That's bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. Friends, the final third of 1 Samuel follows David on the run from King Saul. And as you read it through, which I hope you're doing as we're going through this, it can feel a little bit like an extended chase scene. The hero lurches from one crisis to another, barely escaping each time, and the question, will he ever find safety? And it might be tempting to skim over these passages because they're quite long and they can seem a little bit repetitive. But to do that would actually miss their great importance. We need to set aside our own perception and our own preference of what makes something interesting and what makes something worthwhile, and let the Bible set the agenda for us. And as we do that, we will see what might otherwise seem to drag on is actually much more significant than we might have thought. And the Psalms, they give us a clue to the importance of these years that David spent as a fugitive. 7 of the Psalms are explicitly linked to events in this section of 1 Samuel, and many more express distress that might well date from these dark days. And David and Kieran, I think, are going to spend a bit of time over the next couple of weeks, while Alex and I are on holiday, dealing with some of those Psalms. Or they may choose to do something different. That's up to them. But we as Christians need to make note of this use of the Psalms and this part of David's story, because also the New Testament frequently cites the Psalms to explain and to proclaim Jesus. I mean, most famous is Jesus' cry from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" They were David's words before they were Jesus' words, perhaps written in this very period of 1 Samuel that we are studying. So the question must be, what is the connection between David's desperate suffering and Jesus' death on the cross? The Psalms lead us to seeing David's pain, and then the New Testament uses the Psalms to help us to understand Jesus as the Christ. And that is why these chapters of 1 Samuel are so important. They help us better grasp the gospel that Jesus is the Christ who must suffer and rise from the dead. And it's not insignificant then that about a third of each gospel focuses on the final week of Jesus' life, just as a third of 1 Samuel focuses on David's trials. David's suffering and deliverance are a foreshadowing of Jesus' suffering and resurrection. David's running begins in 1 Samuel chapter 19 when, for the third time, Saul hurls his spear at him and then sends assassins to David's house to kill him. And as he runs, he first goes to Samuel at Ramah in chapter 19, verse 18, and then he works with his friend Jonathan to see if Saul has changed his mind in chapter 20, and it's very clear that Saul is committed to killing David, and so David goes to Ahimelech the priest, where he receives food and a remarkable weapon, as we saw last week. And now his journey continues, and what he does next is actually quite shocking. It sounds reckless. This story in 1 Samuel 21, 10-15, it's quite brief, but it's vivid, and it's remarkable that David survives. And David wrote 2 psalms about this particular event. Psalm 56 is David's desperate cry in the midst of his fear. And then Psalm 34 is his joyful praise once the ordeal was over. And as we follow David's run in 1 Samuel 21, We will also listen to those Psalms and we'll reflect on how David's experience really points us to Jesus and helps us understand Jesus' suffering and Jesus' glory far more deeply. So now look at verse 10 of 1 Samuel chapter 21. Nob, where David met Ahimelech and received food and a weapon, it's not far from Saul's hometown in Gibeah. It was a busy place. It's called the City of the Priests in chapter 22, verse 19. It's a place where many people are coming and going. And if David can't stay safely with Samuel at Ramah, he certainly can't stay very long at this place called Nob, especially since we saw last week he had arrived under false pretenses, claiming to be on urgent business from Saul, and he's been spotted by one of Saul's men. Saul is the threat. David is in real danger still. Quite how serious the danger is demonstrated by what he chooses to do. In verse 10, and David rose and fled that day from Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. Now that is a stunning move. It is bold, maybe even reckless. But the presence of Saul, as we see in that verse, is so threatening as his reach extends throughout his kingdom that David has to leave Saul's territory. Now, Gath is about 40 kilometres southwest of Nob, down from the hills and now on the coastal plain. It's beyond Saul's domain, out of his reach, but that's the only advantage of this place. Gath is one of the 5 Philistine cities, and that's who David has been leading a war against, successfully. And if you find the name of that town, Gath, if you find that familiar, well, it really should be, because it was the hometown of Goliath. That is the last place you would think David would be able to find a welcome. Oh, and do you recall from last week what weapon David is carrying? David has turned up in Gath carrying Goliath's own sword. He'd said in verse 9, there is none like it. Anyone seen carrying it immediately would recognize it, and David is carrying it right into Goliath's hometown. But Saul is such a threat to David that fleeing even to this seems safer than spending one more day in Saul's kingdom. Are you starting to feel, friends, how desperate a situation David is in? You'll see the phrase in verse 10, he went to Achish, king of Gath. It's probably meaning he's going to his city, not going to his door and knocking on the palace door to be let in. He's just in that particular city under the domain of that particular king. In Psalm 56, we're going to have a little bit of a look at soon, we're going to hear the cry of a man who is caught in terror and in peril, and in this peril, he is terrified. Well, if David's plan is going to be hiding in plain sight, we find that that's not going to work. The city's intelligence network and his own fame are working against him. And verses 11 and 12 are what we're looking at now. Achish's men recognize him and they report it to the king. But look at what they say in verse 11. They say, is this not David, the king of the land? Did not they sing to one another of him in dances? Saul has struck down his thousands and David his 10,000s. You notice something extraordinary in that? I mean, throughout 1 Samuel, we have been noticing that people say things that are more profound than they recognise themselves. And this event here might be one of the most significant ones of those instances. From the mouth of the Philistines, who do they say David is? They say he is the king of the land. And the question is, where did they get that idea from? Because no one in Israel yet is calling David king. It seems that the Philistines have noticed what our narrator has told us in chapter 18, verse 30, that then the princes of the Philistines came out in battle, And as often as they came out, David had more success than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was highly esteemed. It seems that David's effective leadership in war, his effective success in battle, has led the Philistines to think that David is the king rather than Saul. And the Saul that the Israelite women were singing has also reached Gath, where the people in Gath have drawn the same conclusion that Saul found so insulting back in chapter 18, verses 6 to 9. But the words of these residents of Achish's town are truer than they know themselves, because David is to be Israel's king. Back in chapter 16, we heard God say to Samuel that this was the case when Samuel anointed him. Jonathan has symbolically handed over his robe to David, and now even the Philistines are unwittingly acknowledging that David really is the chosen king of Israel. Ironically, the thing that made it unsafe for David to remain in Israel is also the thing that makes it unsafe for him to remain in Gath. Verse 12, and David took these words to heart and was much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. Back in chapter 18, verses 17 and 21 and 25, Saul had hoped the Philistines might get rid of David. And in David's desperate decision to run away, it looks like Saul's wish might come true. David is much afraid. And we'll soon see that the Philistines seize him, and they do bring him to Achish. But before we look at that, we turn to Psalm 56. It's a psalm that is titled A Miktan of David when the Philistines seized him in Gath. In that psalm, David cries out under threat. Not only threat from the Philistines, but also threat from Saul. His enemies in this psalm blur together as one in his mind. Psalm 56 says, Be gracious to me, O God, for man tramples on me. All day long an attacker oppresses me. My enemies trample on me all day long, for many attack me proudly. And then as you look further down, he says again, All day long they injure my cause. All their thoughts are against me for evil. They stir up strife. They lurk. They watch my steps as they have waited for my life. All day long. You notice he says that again and again in that psalm. There seems to be no end to the danger that is coming against David. One threat after another, from 1 Samuel 19 to 1 Samuel 21, and now the day he flees from Saul's presence, he's trembling in Achish's presence. And Psalm 56 stresses both the reality and the wickedness of these threats that are against him. The verbs pile up in the psalm: tramples, oppresses, attack, injure, lurk, waited. Their evil intent is clear, proud, and for evil. And these attacks are not just against any man, they're attacks against the one who is the Lord's anointed one. And in this account in Samuel, it is the only time where David is said to be afraid of his enemies. And Psalm 56 explains why fear is actually very rarely mentioned by David. It's because, it says in Psalm 56, when I am afraid, says David, I put my trust in you. In God, whose word I praise. In God I trust. I shall not be afraid. What can flesh do to me? David responds to fear with trust. Not some kind of vague piety, but a grounded confidence in the word of God, whose word I praise, he says. Oh, certainly God has spoken to all Israel at Sinai, yes, but more personally in 1 Samuel 16 verse 12, over David himself, arise, anoint him, for this is he. And David clings to the word that promised him the kingdom. saying, "What can flesh do to me? If God is for him, who can be against him?" A reflection of Romans 8:31. "You have kept count of my tossings," David writes. "Put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your book? Then my enemies will turn back in the day I call. This I know," writes David, "that God is for me." And as David writes that, it's not wishful thinking. David is the Lord's anointed one, the one who is after God's own heart, the one who God has seen for himself. And the Psalm's refrain gives the heart of David's faith. Verses 10 to 12 of that psalm: "In God, whose word I praise, in the Lord, whose word I praise. In God I trust, I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me?" Psalm 56 casts a spotlight on 1 Samuel 21 verse 12. Oh yes, David was afraid, but he trusted the God who had spoken. Now in verses 13 to 15 we turn to David's escape. Throughout 1 Samuel, there is very little record of the strategies that David used in most of his battles. It's interesting that a lot of other histories of ancient times put quite a bit of detail there, but the narrator of the Bible doesn't seem interested in giving that. But David is very clearly a courageous and capable military commander. But his escape from Achish doesn't use any weapons. Look at verse 13. We're back in 1 Samuel chapter 21 again. "So he changed his behaviour before them and pretended to be insane in their hands, and made marks on the doors of the gate and let his spittle run down his beard." In their hands, well, this confirms that David has been seized and brought to the king. But what a performance he gives! Scraping the door, drooling down his beard, putting on the act of a madman, and in verses 14 and 15 we see that it works. "Then Achish said to his servants, 'Behold, you see the man is mad. Why then have you brought him to me? Do I lack madmen, that you have brought this fellow to behave as a madman in my presence? So shall this fellow come into my house?'" Achish is repulsed and dismissive of David. The idea that this creature who is doing these things and drooling is the king of the land seems absolutely laughable to him. He just wants him gone. And so, as the next chapter begins, David makes his escape. And in this there is quite thick irony. Achish declares himself surrounded by fools and proves it. His enemy number one escapes with nothing but a bit of slobber and some scratching at the gate. David's decision to run away from run away to Gath, it didn't look particularly wise, but it certainly proves he's got guts. But if that's all we see in the story, we've missed the point. We've missed the real reason that David survived. The psalm shows what's really happening. At the end of Psalm 56, David prays, "For you have delivered my soul from death, yes, my feet from falling, that I may walk before God in the light of life." Even before the escape, he was confident that God would deliver his anointed one. Psalm 34 picks up this praise. Its title links it to this day, to the day that David, here's the title of the psalm, Psalm 34's title, the day that David changed his behaviour before Abimelech, that is Achish, so that he drove him out and went away. And in that psalm, David says, "I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. My soul makes it boast in the Lord. Let the humble hear and be glad. Oh, magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt his name forever." Together, "I sought the Lord, and he answered me, and delivered me from all my fears. Those who look at him are radiant, and their faces shall never be ashamed. This poor man cried, and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all his troubles. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and delivers them. In Psalm 34, the prayer of Psalm 56 was answered. God did deliver David. Perhaps David sang this psalm in the cave of Adullam, recorded in the very next chapter, where he's joined by his family and 400 troubled men, singing to them of how this poor man cried and the Lord heard him. And then he invites them to join in with his praises. The Lord redeems the life of his servants. None of those who take refuge in him will be condemned. Those two psalms show that David's escape was not merely an act of cleverness. It was something arranged by God himself, and it was therefore profoundly significant and deeply formative for a man who is God's chosen king, God's Messiah. Well, friends, as we finish looking at this little passage, we do so as Christian people who look back at this account not only through the lens of the Psalms, but also through the lens of the Gospel. And we can see how the threats to David pointed forward to the hostility that Jesus encountered. As opposition grew around Jesus, he was reliving David's experience. The hostility against him was real, but even more significant. Jesus makes this clear as he speaks to his disciples in Matthew chapter 10, verses 17 and 18, where he says to them, "Beware of men, for they will deliver you over to courts and flog you in their synagogues, and you will be dragged before governors and kings for my sake, to bear witness before them and the Gentiles." Oh yes, friends, the hostility is real. But we also see the wickedness of those who opposed David, anticipates the wickedness of those who crucify Jesus. We grasp its depth when we remember who Jesus. Its depth when we remember who Jesus is. 1 Corinthians 2 verse 8. Who did they crucify? They crucified the Lord of glory. When Jesus warned that this same wickedness would be directed at his followers, he says, "A disciple is not above his teacher, nor a servant above his master. It is enough for the disciple to be like his teacher and the servant to be like his master. If they have called the master of the house Beelzebul, how much more will they malign those of his household?" Oh yeah, the hostility against Jesus is wicked, and the hostility against those who follow Jesus is likewise wicked, as it is real. As David trusted God in Gath, so Jesus, in the depths of suffering, trusted his Father. "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit," he says. And Christian friend, when you experience suffering, when you face suffering, when you face hostility that is real, it may not be the hostility of death, but it could be a hostility within your workplace. It could be a mocking and a scorn. Don't be surprised. Remember 1 Samuel chapter 4, verses 12 to 19. Where Peter writes, "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice, insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed." If you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. Let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or a meddler. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. Therefore, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good. Thank you for listening to the recording of the Dublin Bible Talks. You can join us in real time on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Dublin Time on Zoom, bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. That's bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks.